Welcome to the Purposes of Morality lecture video. We're going to discuss in this video the concept of morality and some of the reasons why we would need it. So we have completed the prolegomena section, the things we needed to talk about before we could talk about ethics. So now we're going to start talking about ethics. So for this lecture, the first person we're going to talk about is Thomas Hobbes. And you can see his dates there, 1588 to 1679, and his most famous work is Leviathan. And Hobbes is the person who is credited with what's known as the social contract theory. And what we're going to do with Hobbes is I'm going to read a section from Leviathan, and then I'm going to kind of discuss it a little bit, and then there's a video I'm going to have you click and watch separately. And we're going to look at that and talk about that for a bit. So we'll jump into Hobbes. Now this is very old English, so you will find that it's going to be different from the English we speak today. But just listen to this, and then we will have an opportunity for you to ask questions in the discussion chat. But from this equality of ability arises equality of hope in the attaining of our ends. And therefore, if any two men desire the same thing, which nevertheless they both cannot both enjoy, they become enemies. And in their way to their end, which is primarily their own conservation and sometimes their own delectation only, endeavor to destroy or subdue one another. And from hence it comes to pass that whenever an invader has no more to fear than another man's single power, if one plant, sow, build, possess a convenient seat, others may probably be expected to come prepared with forces united to dispossess and deprive him not only of the fruit of his labor, but also of his life or liberty, and the invader is again in like danger of another. Now we're just going to pause here. So Hobbes is saying that there's equality of ability, and this equality of hope of attaining our ends. Now what he's saying here is that basically all men are about the same in terms of ability. Now some are stronger, a little bit stronger, or a little bit smarter, but nobody is so strong or so smart that you couldn't get up a team of other people and overthrow them, is kind of what he's saying. So that's what he's saying. So if they desire something that they both can't have, and they will end up trying to subdue or destroy one another. So they'll fight over it. And so then from hence it comes to pass, when someone has no more to fear than a single man's power, if you plant, sow, build, all of these different things that you might have, then he would expect somebody to come over and try to take it away from him, dispossess or deprive him of the fruit of his labor, so the things he has, or his life, or his freedom, so life or liberty. And then if that happens, the invader is in like danger of another. So they would be just as concerned about someone coming and doing that to them. So let's continue. There is always war of everyone against everyone. Hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war. And such a war is of every man against every man. For war consisteth not in battle only, or the act of fighting, but in the tract of time wherein the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known. And therefore the notion of time is to be considered in the nature of war as it is in the nature of weather. For as the nature of foul weather lieth not in a shower or two of rain, but in an inclination thereto of many days together, so the nature of war consisteth not in actual fighting, but in the known disposition thereto. During all the time there is no assurance to the contrary, all other time is peace. So let's look at this again. Because people are about of equal strength and will come to take your stuff, then there's always war of everyone against everyone. So that would be a time, during this time, he says, without a common power to keep all of them in awe, so without some kind of force that's stronger than the individuals to keep them in line, then they're always going to be trying to take each other's stuff or kill them or take their freedom or put them in slavery or whatever it is. So this is a condition called war of every man against every man. And he says war is not just battle, or the act of fighting, but the tract of time wherein the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known. So the issue here is not just the conflicts, not just the fights, but all of the time when you might have a fight. So, and he likens this to weather. He says, because the problem with foul weather is not just in that you get a shower or two of rain, but the idea that that rain could come over a period of extended time. He says the same kind of thing with war. So if you were going to plant a field, you may plow the field and get the field ready to sow your grain. And if it looked like it was going to rain, you wouldn't sow your grain, because if the shower comes, it'll wash the grain away, and you won't get the field won't have the grain sufficiently sowed into it. So you wait till the shower's over, then you sow your grain. But if it keeps looking like it's going to rain for days and days and days and never does rain, you never sow your grain, because you're scared that it's going to get washed away. You need it to be clear weather and look like it's going to be good weather. Same kind of thing with war. If you're scared of someone coming to take your stuff, you're never going to plant your fields or do those kinds of things, as we'll see in just a moment. It's the time when war could happen that is just as bad and sometimes even worse than war itself. Continuing on, whatsoever therefore is a consequent to a time of war, where every man is enemy to every man, the same is consequent to the time wherein men live without other security than what their own strength and their own invention shall furnish them withal. In such condition there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So, what he's saying is, during this time when there could be war, not the battles themselves, but this time where you know a battle could come, men, when they don't live with any security except their own strength and invention, what they can have of their own strength and invention, there's no place for industry, because you're not going to invent something or start to manufacture something if you're not sure that you're going to get the benefits of it. No culture of the earth, so whether you're planting orchards or fields, you're not going to do that because you may not get the benefit of it. No navigation, so no going out on the ocean to navigate and find new places and things like that, or use of commodities that may be imported by the sea. So trade, why would you do that if you're scared someone might come and take your stuff? No commodious building, building of projects that are for the mutual good. No instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, so large clearing of fields or places that you could use, perhaps quarrying things. No knowledge of the face of the earth, so exploration. No account of time, so you don't have people watching the seasons and the stars and doing all those kind of calendar issues. No arts, which of course would be fine arts, and then probably also in here he's referring to kind of artisan crafts of making, even goods and services that would be kind of artisan type. So leather working, metal working, and things like that would probably be included with the fine arts. No letters, which would be writing or education there. No society. So there's no civil place. And which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So this is very interesting. And in fact, there's a lot of shows that explore this kind of conception. I usually ask how many people watch The Walking Dead, because Walking Dead, it's not really a show about zombies, it's a show about survivors and what happens when you have a threat, the constant threat, kind of like the zombies are, but you have society that has collapsed, and how do people get along? How do they try to rebuild? Who holds on to what used to be? Who embraces the chaos and just takes things that they want? And so you see in a show like that these kinds of situations. Another show that several years ago was called Falling Skies, and that had an alien invasion that wiped out governments, and you had kind of a resistance fighting against them, and you had a lot of these same kinds of struggles. Do you fall in and try to keep a semblance of the former society? Do you fight against the aliens, or do you just live for yourself and do the best you can for yourself? So, just to summarize Hobbes's thought, all people are about equal in their strength, and people generally do what they think is in their best interest to get things that they want. The state of nature of war against all is in the interest of almost no one. So, this state of constant war is good for almost no one. Now, it's not good for no one, but it is good for almost no one. And so because of that, we give up some of our liberty and agree to live under a social contract which has rules and a ruler. So because of that situation, sometime in the past, humanity realized this. So we realized, we're better off having some kind of structure in place to keep the peace and to enforce rules. And we have to give up a little bit of our freedom for that, but that's worth it. Now, I want to go back to the state of nature. War against all is in the interest of almost no one. In the series Falling Skies, there was an individual by the name of Pope. And he was... so the alien invasion came and wiped out governments and killed a lot of the population, started taking the children to use them as kind of laborers. They actually were, you find out later on, kind of turning them into some of the aliens, or a hybrid of it. And Pope was in prison. He was a person who could not function in the world with the rules. He was a rule breaker. He didn't listen. It got him thrown in jail. When the alien invasion hit, he was able to get free, and he had a ragtag band of people that were out for themselves. And so one of the conflicts they had in there was it was better for Pope in the alien apocalypse, in kind of this alien war zone, than it had been before the aliens came. So everybody else wanted the time to go back to when the aliens were gone, but not Pope, because he and people like him functioned better. They had a better life when they did not have the law out to get them. So you see here in Hobbes's thought that not everybody is going to be better off. Most of us will. But there's a realization that some people are better off individually without, in this state of war, they actually survive perhaps a little better. So, morality is a form of social control where we accept rules that we expect will make life better for most of us on the whole. Some may be better off without the rules, but the rules benefit the majority. So the people like Pope would be better off without the rules, maybe, but the majority will be better off with the rules, so the majority should impose rules, even at the expense of the minority who would be better off to live in the state of total war, because you would have more people. It would be much better state for most people in that state, in the having this social contract. And although some may cheat, if most follow the rules, all will benefit better than in the state of war. So there's a realization that some of these people will cheat the system, but having people who cheat the system is better for everybody than not having a system at all. So you have police or the magistrate, people who try to catch the cheaters and put them in jail or punish them for cheating, but the effect of cheaters on the system doesn't hurt the system so bad that we're better off not to have a system, is the point there. So that's Hobbes's thought. So morality then is this social control that allows us to function as a society, to plant crops, to build buildings, to get along together, because we're fearful of this Leviathan, which would be basically government, that could come and crush us. So while I may be stronger than you, or you may be stronger than me, and if I wanted your stuff, if I'm not strong enough to beat you up, I could get some other people, we could go take your stuff, and then another bigger group could come take it from me. Hobbes's view says the government is the strongest. It's the Leviathan. It's the monster. Leviathan is a big sea monster. So it's something that no matter how smart you are, no matter how strong you are, you can't fight a monster that can suck down a ship. And so it's just so much more powerful. And that's kind of the idea of government, that it would be there to eat the people who don't follow the rules. So you're scared of the Leviathan, so you stay in line. Okay, and that's the social contract theory concept. Okay, so if you're familiar with The Lord of the Flies, I have a short video summary here. This is a book by William Golding, and it depicts this Hobbesian view of humanity. So in the presentation, the actual PowerPoint presentation, you can click the link and watch the video summary. I'm going to I would suggest you pause the video now, go watch that video summary, and then come back and finish watching the video when you're done. So I'll pause now and then restart shortly. All right, you should have watched the video now. Let's talk about that. So that was kind of a summary of The Lord of the Flies. And from the story there, from the video, if you've read the book, good, you see that after the boys show up on the island, they have a semblance of their society that has remained. But slowly, the rule of law or civilization descends into tribalism, rule of the strong, or barbarism. And you see, while the video didn't go into it in depth, Piggy is pretty much the representative of reason and philosophy. Simon, who it didn't talk about much at all, is the proxy or the symbol for religion here. And what this shows is, in this Hobbesian type view, in this story, reason and philosophies can't keep society together. Religion can't keep society together. In fact, everything, civilization, which is symbolized by Ralph, is falling apart, and it's about to be destroyed. And what saves it at the end? Military power, the naval officer arriving. The adults, they save civilization from tribalism or barbarianism. Okay? So, the discussion of, or the picture of humanity that we see in The Lord of the Flies really is in line with the Hobbesian view of humanity that we see from his writings. So, I think that's interesting for us to try to look at the connections there and see in fiction how you would put these ideas. So, all right, we're going to change gear a little bit now, and these are 5 Purposes of Morality by Louis Poyman. And so these are the 5 things he says. This is what morality does for us. The first one is to keep society from falling apart. So because of morality, we can actually have a society. It keeps us from, it tells us what we can do, what we can't do, and so we can actually get along together. It ameliorates human suffering, so it reduces suffering. Having morality, and particularly obligations to try to help people who are suffering, reduces human suffering, so it makes it better. Promotes human flourishing. It's kind of the flipping of the coin from reducing suffering to promoting flourishing. So morality helps us be the kind of people that we should be. It keeps society together, reduces suffering. The next one, resolve conflicts of interest in just and orderly ways. So there will be things that we both want, but that we both can't have. How do we resolve that? Do we use violence or do we use some other means? If you have morality, then there are rules of how you solve conflicts. And if everybody follows those rules, then we could see a semblance of justice and order in that. So that's why we have laws, in courts and things like that, based off of ultimately an underlying concept of order and justness, which derives from morality. And then to assign praise and blame, reward and punishment, and guilt. So, what is the good life? How do I know what kind of life I should live? How do I know whether this one behavior should be rewarded or punished? How do I know whether I should be guilty or innocent of something? And morality helps us to define that. So these are 5 purposes of morality for Poyman. Keep that in mind. You'll see these again. There are also some moral principles, 5 traits or 5 aspects or traits here. These traits are things that, if something is a moral principle, Poyman argues that it will have these 5 traits. And if something does not have all 5 of these traits, then whatever it is, it's not a moral principle, because a moral principle would have to satisfy the conditions of having all of these traits. So let's look at them. The first is prescriptivity. So moral principles are normative. That means that you should do them. You have an obligation to do them. They're not descriptive. Okay, so normative is contrasted with the concept of descriptive. Something is normative if you have a requirement to do it. Something is descriptive if it is simply telling you how things are. So if I say the weather was stormy, or the weather was cloudy today, that's descriptive. It just simply describes the way it was. It doesn't say that it should have been any particular way. If I say, well, it should have been cloudy, then that would be a normative statement. It should have been that way. Now, with moral principles, I say that you should tell the truth, or truth-telling is normative. So that's what you ought to do. Versus I can say, well, so-and-so lied. That may be descriptive. saying this is what happened. But what should they have done? They should have told the truth, because if truth-telling is a moral principle, then it would be normative. So prescriptivity, think of this as a prescription. Prescriptions tell you what you should do or what you ought to do. So moral principles are normative. They're not descriptive. So they don't simply tell you how the world is. That would be descriptive. They tell you how the world ought to be or how your behavior ought to be. Okay, they're normative. The next is universalizability. Moral principles apply to all equally. If it is going to be a moral principle, it must apply to everyone and apply to everyone the same way. So if people are not held to those principles, then it is not universalizable. Okay? And I see I've got a typo there. I need to go fix that. Overriding this is the next principle. Moral principles take precedence over other concerns. So what this means is that if it might make financial sense to not give somebody money that you have, that you need, but if you owe somebody money, if you borrowed it and you need to pay them back, then the moral principle of fulfilling your promise might would tell you need to give money to the other person that you owe them. And even if the financial sense would say, well, don't give away money that you have, the moral principle, if you owe it to them, that you ought to repay that debt, should override the financial principle of I'm better off to have money rather than give it away. So moral principles have to take precedence over non-moral concerns. And we'll eventually end up talking about what you do when you have two or more moral principles that seem to be in conflict with one another and how you resolve that. But moral principles should override non-moral principles. Publicity is the next one. Moral principles must be made public to guide actions. So moral principles can't be secret. They've got to be available for the public. You have to be able to know what you're supposed to do. They have to be publicized and talked about in order for them to be moral principles. So if they're things that are hidden and secret, then they can't be moral principles. And then practicability. Moral principles must be workable or doable. In other words, what you are supposed to do has to be something that you can actually do. So moral principles must be things that can be done. That's what practicability means. So these 5 traits, prescriptivity tells you what you should do, not just what has been done. Universalizability means it applies to everybody equally. Overridingness means it has to take precedence over other concerns. Publicity means it has to be public to guide actions. People have to know what they're supposed to do. And then practicability means that they must be able to be done. They must be doable. So for a principle, according to Poyman, to meet the criteria of being a moral principle, it must satisfy these 5 traits. So those are, as we just looked at, purposes of morality, what it's supposed to do for us, principles or traits of moral principles. Those are the 2 things that we've just looked at now. Right now we're going to start talking about egoism versus altruism. And we're going to do that with a little bit of a study right here. So egoism is the idea that you should do what is in your best interest, and altruism is the idea that you ought to do what is in the best interest of others. So we're going to do a little bit of a study here. We're going to just contrast Jack and Jim. So what I want to ask you to think about is, who would you rather be? Would you rather be Jack, or would you rather be his brother Jim? So Jack is a person, he looks to be moral, but he's really evil. He's a handsome person, he's charming, smart, but he's also manipulative. He uses others to his advantage. He's exploited Jim, who is his brother, since childhood, and Jack is a wealthy executive. Jack has taken credit for Jim's invention. He cheats others to make money, but his city voted him the ideal citizen. His wife and children adore him, but they are not really close to him. They don't really know him because he's not there much. But he's the kind of person that sweeps in with all kinds of gifts and things. If you get around him very long, you start to see through the facade, but if you just see him occasionally, he looks like he's a good person. Okay, so that's Jack. Jim is the opposite of that. He looks to be immoral, but he's actually a good person. He's not handsome or charming. He's modest, but he's completely honest. and he's poor and unemployed. He's been framed for a crime that his brother committed. So his brother Jack committed the crime and knew he could get Jim to take the fall for it, so he did. And Jim is in prison for that crime. He has a bad reputation. He's shunned by society as a moral, social, and business failure. So everything that Jack is, Jim is not, and that includes being handsome and wealthy and admired. So those are the two situations. What I want you to ask yourself is, would it be better to be Jack or Jim? Would it be better to be a person who lives a seemingly virtuous life but is an immoral person, or someone who seems to be immoral but is actually a good person, a moral person? And then how might you determine which is better? I want you to think about that. Think about your answer, and in the video discussion, give me your answer honestly before we go through the rest of this slide. So determine now, take a moment, pause the video, write down who you would rather be, whether you would be rather be Jack or Jim, and why. And I invite you to post that into the discussion. Now, so I'd write it out now, and then we'll go through the rest of these discussions. You may change your mind, but I'd like to have your input there, and for you in the discussion to say, hey, I want to be Jack or I want to be Jim. This is why, and then, but I either changed my mind or I didn't change my mind based on the rest of the lecture. Okay, so I invite you to pause the video and do that now. All right, how would we answer this question from different perspectives? So the first is the religious answer. And so for monotheistic religions, the religious answer would be that God will judge people on the basis of their deeds. So monotheistic religions would be Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And the concept there that you have an all-powerful, all-knowing God who knows what the deeds you do, and so you can't fool God, so you would have judgment to deal with, and so you should be Jim for monotheistic religions. So you should not be immoral, because Jack may have fooled everybody else, but he can't fool God. And so that would be the monotheistic religious answer. The other way that we're going to look at this from a religious answer are pantheistic religions. So we have Hinduism and Buddhism, which are pantheistic religions. So monotheistic means one God. Mono means one. Theistic is referring to God. So one God. Pantheistic religions refers to God is in all, or God is all. Okay, it's not polytheism. There's really very few polytheistic religions that are major religions. Poly would be contrasted with mono. Poly means many, and so that would be a religion with many gods. But pantheism, Hinduism and Buddhism are pantheistic, and it has to do with their conception of the universe all as being part of a singular thing, and that God is everything. And so that we're not going to get into this now. That's for a religions class. But you have these concepts that make pantheism and polytheism very different. But in pantheistic religions, you have the concept of karma. And karma is not what you see on social media, where if somebody did something wrong to you, karma is going to get them back. Karma is the concept that you either build up karma or you get rid of karma in this life that we're living. And based on whether you gained karma or you lost a sufficient amount of karma, which has to do with the amount of suffering that you reduce or cause, then when you are reincarnated, you will either be reincarnated as something better or worse. So if you are a human, you might get reincarnated as an insect or an animal if you do a lot of bad things, cause a lot of suffering. Or if you do a lot of good things, you may get reincarnated as a human in a higher class, or as perhaps a cow, because those are sacred and seen as valuable. So there's a bunch of different concepts here of how you may be reincarnated in pantheistic religions and what happens to you. But the concept of karma there is something that you can't avoid. So pantheistic religions would also say you should be Jim, because Jack has caused more suffering. And even though society hasn't blamed Jack for what he's done, karma will have attached itself to him, and in the reincarnation he will be worse off than he was because he's causing more karma. He's collecting more karma. So the religious answer and the monotheistic, the religious answer for both monotheism and pantheism would be to be Jim. Okay? So that's how we would answer that one. What about how the Greeks would answer it? The Socratic answer. What would they say? Well, the Greeks would say to be Jim, because the Greek concept of goodness was that the good is good for you, so being good or doing good is good for you, just like health is good for you and disease is bad. The moral person is better off even if they're not more successful. So what they're saying is, if you do good, you are being human the right way. The person who does evil is being human wrongly. They're doing it wrong. So you're better off to be the right kind of human than to be the wrong kind of human. Well, what about the person that doesn't care about being moral? Well, the Greeks would say the moral person is still better, a more authentic human. They are doing humanity the right way. So the Greek answer, or the Socratic answer, would be to be Jim, not Jack. The existentialist answer would be a little bit different, though. You have to say you pick. You just decide whether you're going to be a Jack or a Jim. And the reason is that morality is something that can't be justified rationally. So you can't make a rational argument as to why you should be one or the other. You simply decide who you're going to be. So each person must make the ultimate choice of how they will live. Reason itself is insufficient to support either decision. So it's not something that you can solve with arguments. It's something you simply do. That would be the existentialist answer. So the existentialist would put basically a question mark. Who do you want? Should you be Jack or Jim? Well, you just choose who you're going to be. There's not a should involved. John Hospers, we have a quote from him. Why should I be moral? Can only be answered with a response because it is right. Self-interested answers don't work because they seek self-interested reasons to go against self-interest, which is contradictory. So what Hospers is saying is the only kind of answer you can say about what you should do. Should you be Jack or should you be Jim? You say, well, I should be Jim because Jim is the right kind of life, or because that's right. And I want to do what's right. Well, sometimes in doing what's right, you actually have to make decisions that go against your self-interest, which is contradictory. So he says that's how you get into logical problems. Let me give you an example. Suppose you were at a fast food restaurant and you're going to order fast food, and you were hungry, you really wanted to eat, you hadn't eaten in a while, you really needed to eat, and you've only got a few bucks left, and your payday's not for another week, so you're really going to be struggling. You don't have much money until your next payday, and you really need some money, but you really need to eat too. And so in front of you there's an old lady, and she orders a meal, and she sets a stack of money on the counter, and she takes some of that money and pays her bill, and she walks down to the end of the counter, and she's left a $50 bill right there on the thing. She didn't realize it. She thought she had picked everything, but she didn't see that she missed that. And so she's moved on. She's not looking that way. It's set in such a place that nobody can see it except you, who is the only other person in line. So you could simply, with no consequence, take that $50, put it in your pocket, and say, hey, now I've got an extra $50 to help me through the week. Okay? So what should you do? Well, Hospers would say that if you say, I should give her the money back because it's right, then you're faced with this kind of dilemma. The right thing to do is to give her the money back. And I want to do the right thing could be your reasoning there. But would you be better off to have an extra $50 or not to have an extra $50? So by giving the money back, you are taking $50 you could have, even though it didn't belong to you, but you could have had it, and giving it away is hurting you financially, especially because you need the money. So Hospers would say, if you claim you should give her the money back because it's the right thing to do, then you're going against your self-interest by saying you have to do things that it's in your self-interest to do something that's right. Okay, so you have this contradiction here. And so that's the problem that you get with that. And so morality then becomes something of a choice or an opinion. And is morality a bigger issue than which ice cream flavor preference you have or which toilet paper you prefer? So when we talk about morality, for the existentialist, is it, I mean, you could say, oh, I just like chocolate or I like vanilla. Is morality something like that, or is it something different? Probably most of us would say, well, it's probably something different than that. It's something more than just preference or a choice that we're going to make. Okay? So is to kind of contrast the existentialist claim, you have had people that have given what's known as a rationalist split-level answer. And this is saying that you can use logic to make these you can use arguments and logic to make these kind of decisions, but what you have to do is operate on at least two different levels. So the way you would do this is you would start off by saying that what kind of life do you think, living a life like Jack or living a life like Jim, is likely to maximize your happiness? And most of the time, if you look at it, you probably say, well, the moral life is more likely to lead to a life that has the most possible happiness overall. Because if you're a moral person, then you don't have to worry about breaking the law or people getting as mad at you or things like that. You do the right thing. And once you accept the idea that the moral life is likely to result in more happiness, then some of the choices you make may not maximize your immediate self-interest, but if they take you along toward this ultimate goal of being a moral person, then you would believe that they are in your ultimate best interest. So this split-level view consists of two levels of reasoning. First, the higher order, or second level, what you would call a reflected general level. Which way of living will likely maximize my happiness? And you may decide that the moral life, or living a life like Jim, is the one that's going to do that. And then you have these lower order, first level questions or things that come up. Which action in this particular situation best fits with my choice above? Okay, so in this example, if you're at the fast food counter and you have this $50 that's been abandoned in front of you, the contradiction between saying I'm going against my best interests to give the money back to the person, you could say being the honest person is actually in line with the higher order of reasoning, and so you wouldn't want to steal the money even though you could get away with it, or take the money even though you could get away with it. And in doing the right thing, you could say that you are progressing towards this higher level of wanting to be an honest person, even though in the short run it's making you a little worse off because you don't have the money that you could have had. So that's a way that you can answer with the rationalist split level approach, the existentialist claim that logic cannot be used to answer moral questions. So because of that, the rationalist can answer that you could want to live a moral life. However, notice that in this approach, you have to determine whether you think the moral life or perhaps the immoral life is going to lead you to more happiness. And nothing says that you're going to choose that the moral life ultimately is what you think is going to lead the most happiness. You might say, you know what, I can get away with it. I can do it. I can be like Jack. I can get away with these things, and so I ought to be the immoral person. And you can still use the same kind of reasoning here, and then there may be times when you want to perform what seems to be like a moral action because it will give you more benefit than the immoral action would. So anyway, that's the rationalist split level approach. It tells us you can use logic to determine whether you could be Jack or Jim, but it doesn't really tell you which one you should be. So it just says you can use logic there. Okay, now we're going to kind of talk a little bit about Ayn Rand and what her book was called, The Virtue of Selfishness. And Ayn Rand is an interesting person. She is someone who is very steeped in her times, and she is. Well, let's look at this quote. The objectivist ethics hold that the actor must always be the beneficiary of his action. This comes from The Virtue of Selfishness. So Ayn Rand came out of communist Russia, and she did not like communism and the idea that you should do things, everything should be done for the collective. Everything should be done for everybody else, not for yourself. She said that is wrong. She said the actor, the person who does the action, should be the beneficiary of her action. Now, she defines altruism as any action taken for the benefit of the others is good, and any action taken for one's own benefit is evil. Thus, the beneficiary of an action is the only criteria of moral value. So long as the beneficiary is anybody other than oneself, anybody goes. Now, this is a probably very odd definition of altruism, but it's one that fits in with the political climate that she came out of. So she left Russia and came to the came out of Russia to the Western countries to avoid communism and what it was doing. And so she is very much going against this socialism, this communist view, okay? And so she's saying here that the way that they're defining it, which probably many philosophers wouldn't really define it this way, but that doing things for the benefit of others, regardless of what it is, as long as you don't do it for yourself, you do it for someone else, then that's good. Now, here's some of her writings against that. If a man accepts the ethics of altruism, his first concern is not how to live his life, but how to sacrifice it. Altruism erodes men's capacity to grasp the value of an individual life. It reveals a mind from which the reality of a human being has been wiped out. Altruism holds that death is its ultimate goal and standard of value, and that it is logical that renunciation, resignation, self-denial, and every other form of suffering, including self-destruction, are the virtues of its advocates. So, this idea here is that coming out of this political ideology, you should give away your life for the benefit of others and not for yourself. She says this erodes our ability to understand the value of a life and turns our life into not having to live it, but how to die, how to give our life away rather than how to live it. So, Rand says that the highest good is finding our own ego-centered happiness. Man's proper values and interests that concern with his own interest is the essence of moral existence, and that man must be the beneficiary of his own moral actions. So, the good thing to do, the right thing to do, is to try to make sure that you benefit from your actions, not that others benefit. Now, Lewis Pointman summarizes Rand's argument as follows. The perfection of one's abilities in the state of happiness is the highest goal for humans. We have a moral duty to attempt to reach this goal. Ethics of altruism prescribes that we sacrifice our interest in lives for the good of others. Therefore, the ethics of altruism is incompatible with the goal of happiness. So, that's a rejection of altruism. Ethical egoism prescribes that we seek our own happiness exclusively and is such consistent with the happiness goal. Therefore, ethical egoism is the correct theory. So, Pointman summarizes Rand's argument for us, and you can see that. Now, the structure is fine, and we then have to look at the truth value of the claims, and that's where we can have some discussions or some arguments there about whether this perfection of one's abilities in the state of happiness is the highest goal for others. That may or may not be true. Okay, but if it were true, then the argument, if each of these premises were true, then the argument would hold. But the arguing about the truth value of these premises and whether altruism actually prescribes that or whatever, those can be argued. But this is just a description of Rand's arguments. And so Rand would say you need to be an egoist, which you need to look out for yourself. Okay, so Rand's position may say, hey, if you get away with being Jack, you should be Jack. You should maximize your benefit of your actions. And Jim's life certainly was not characterized by him getting the benefit of his actions, because Jack did. This leads us to the paradox of egoism, however, and there's a difficulty in living out a life as an egoist. If an egoist is someone who is always concerned about their own benefit, can an egoist have friends? Think about that. If you only ever act in your only in your best interest, can you have any kind of meaningful relationship? Sorry, there's a typo there too. But if you only ever act in your own best interest, can you ever have any kind of meaningful relationship? Most of us, when we think about a friend, if a friend is only around us, or if we're only around someone for our benefit, then perhaps that's not what we're going to call somebody who is a friend. So, C.K. Chesterton gives us the following quote. This is not a piece of mysticism for saints and heroes. It is a piece of everyday advice for sailors and mountaineers. A soldier surrounded by enemies, if he is to cut his way out, needs to combine a strong desire for living with a strange carelessness about dying. He must not merely cling to life, for then he will be a coward and will not escape. So Chesterton is saying that if you're part of a military, if you're a soldier, you're surrounded by your enemies, your only chance is to put your life on the line for all of your other soldiers. So you have to, in order to try to save your life, you have to risk your life. And if you don't do that, and you just try to cower away, then you're not going to be able to escape and you will lose your life. So the question then, can the egoist have friends? I'm not so sure. Think about someone like Michael Jackson, some of these celebrities that have entourages of people around them, but many of those people are only there for what they can get out of the relationship. And someone like Michael Jackson needed someone to say, I care about you, you can't continue to do these things you're doing or you're going to kill yourself, which happened. But he was surrounded by people who were not friends, because what they wanted was to get their benefit that they could have by being around him. So when we talk about friendship, whether an egoist, a pure egoist, could have friends or not, is a legitimate question for us to consider. Now we're going to look at a couple of paradoxes of egoism. We're going to look at something called the prisoner's dilemma, and then we're going to look at the cheating game. And we're going to talk about that. So if you're familiar, if you've heard of these, again, they may sound somewhat familiar. If you've never heard of these, then this is a brief introduction. Okay, so the first here is the prisoner's dilemma. Suppose that Susan and Sam are spies, and they're in a country, and they're both picked up for being spies. Now, they've agreed that if they were caught, they wouldn't tell on the other person. They would keep their promise to just say nothing. And so that's the promise that they have between them. They're both in the same facility, down in different halls and things like that. So they're separated. And here's the situation. Both of them have the opportunity to either keep silent, say nothing, or to admit they're a spy and say the other person is a spy. Okay? Or to rat out the other person. So here's what happens. If Susan keeps her promise and does not say anything, and Sam keeps his promise, the longest that they can be imprisoned is for 4 months. If Susan breaks her promise and Sam keeps his promise, then Susan will immediately be freed and Sam will have 9 years in jail. If Sam breaks his promise and Susan keeps her promise, same thing. 9 years in jail for Susan, Sam will immediately go free. If they both rat on each other, then they both get 6 years in prison. So, the question is, if they are working in their best interest, if they are only concerned about their best interest, what should they do? What's the choice that they should do? Think about that for a moment. What choice do you think? Well, let's look at the outcomes of the decisions. If Susan breaks her promise and Sam keeps his promise, then Susan will get 0 months. Okay? And so these are the outcomes, and the outcomes are the same for both of them. So that's the best outcome for Susan, is that she gets 0 months, and then Sam would get 9 years. The best thing that can happen for Susan is for her to break their promise and for Sam to keep his promise. If they both keep their promise, then they will both be in prison for 4 months. That's the best overall outcome that could happen for both of them. It is 4 months, and then they go home together, right? If they both break their promise, they'll be in there for 6 years apiece. So that's the third best option. So that's not the best, it's the third best. The worst thing that could happen is that Susan keeps her promise. The worst thing for Susan is that she keeps her promise and Sam breaks his promise, and then she would be in jail for 9 years. Okay? So, what should Susan do? Well, probably most of you are thinking, well, they ought to both keep their promise and they'll both be home in 4 months. And that's exactly the wrong answer. If you are an egoist and you're looking out for your best interest, the best answer is for you to rat out Sam, if you're Susan. Or if you're Susan, to rat out, if you're Sam, to rat out Susan, or Susan to rat out Sam. If you look at this, the best outcome that can happen comes from you breaking a promise. The worst outcome that can happen for you is to keep your promise. We look here, we've got the average. If it's 50% probability of both of these things happening, then if you break your promise, you would expect to be in jail for an average of 3 years. If you keep your promise, you would expect to be in jail for an average of 4 years and 7 months. So the rational choice is to break your promise, even though the best choice for both of you together is to keep your promise. But If you're the egoist and you're only concerned about your best interest, the worst thing that could happen to you is if you keep your promise and the other person breaks it. So the best thing for you to do is to avoid the worst possibility and to get the best average, which would mean that you tell on the other person, you rat out the other person. And if they're both rational egoists, then both Susan and Sam will rat on each other, which means they will both get 6 years in prison, getting the third worst option, or the second worst option, the third best option, and not the second best option. If they could just trust each other and keep their promise, then they would both go home in 4 months rather than 6 years. So this is what's known as the prisoner's dilemma here. What choice should you make? The rational choice is to break your promise, because it keeps you from the worst outcome and it gives you the possibility of the best outcome. But if you have two people who are rational egoists, then they're probably going to get the second worst outcome, the third best. They'll both get 6 years when they could have gotten 4 months. Now, if they were both altruists and they were actually looking out for the opposite, not looking out for what's in their best interest, but looking out for what's in the other person's best interests, then the best interest, if Susan says, what's the best thing that can happen for Sam, is if I keep my promise, because if he breaks his promise, then he'll go home immediately, and if I keep my promise and he keeps his promise, then we'll go home in 4 months. So if they are both egoists and looking out for their own best interests, what will likely happen is they will be in prison for 6 years together. If they were both altruists and looking out for the other person's best interest, then they would be home in 4 months. So the egoist has a problem, because it would be better off for them to be able to look out for the other person's best interest and go home in 4 months. But they can't do that, because the best outcome for them would be to break their promise, and the worst outcome for them would be to keep their promise. So in trying to get what's best for them, they actually get what is the third best option rather than the second best option. So that's the outcomes and decisions for the cheating, or for the prisoner's dilemma. Now we're going to look at this. We're going to look at what's known as the cheating game. And this is the idea of taking the concept of the prisoner's dilemma and say, does it change if we extend the game from more than one turn? If this is a game, then you only have one choice. What if we could say, well, let's extend this game where you can use the previous choices of the other people to influence your future choices, and maybe then we can get to something where they ought to, it's in their best interest to actually work with one another. Okay? So Sam and Susan again. Here's how the game is played. Sam is blue and Susan is green. Each turn, Susan and Sam both choose whether they are going to cheat or cooperate. If they both choose cooperate, they both get $300. If one of them chooses to cheat, so if for this example, if Sam chooses to cheat and Susan chooses cooperate, then Sam gets $500 and Susan loses $100. If Sam chooses to cooperate and Susan cheats, same thing. He loses $100, she gains $500. If they both choose cheat, they both lose $10. So they both are worse off if they both cheat. Okay? They're both better off if they both cooperate. And if one cheats and the other cooperates, then the other person is better off even more, and someone is hurt, the one who cooperated is hurt more. So let's look at this. If we had 10 rounds of each person cooperating, you can say they'd get $300 each round. At the end of 10 rounds, they would both have $3,000. And that's not bad, right? That's the game. So you can both walk out of here, play this game with $3,000. So is that what they're going to choose to do? Is that the rational thing to do, is to just cooperate for 10 rounds and get $3,000? You may say, yes, hey, that sounds great. However, if you're trying to maximize your outcome, then maybe you would say, look, instead of cooperating all 10 rounds, let me cooperate 9 rounds and cheat on round 10. And so Susan is going to be our cheater in these examples, and Sam is going to be the one who cooperates until he's cheated on. So Sam cooperates each turn, Susan cooperates each turn. After 9 turns, they both have $2,700. There's 1 turn left. And so on that term, Sam keeps up. He says, I'm cooperating, and Susan cheats. So she gets an extra $500, and Sam loses $100. So Sam lost 100, he ended up with 2,600, and Susan ended up with 3,200. Well, 3,200 is better than 3,000. So Susan was better off to cheat in round 10. Okay? But let's suppose that Sam is thinking the same thing. What if she's going to go along and then round 10 she's going to cheat me? So what I ought to do is cheat her a round earlier, at round 9. Okay? We're still going to have Susan being the cheater here, but let's look at what would happen at round 9 if we cheated, if we did this. So if you go along till round 9, everybody's getting their 300 per turn, okay, 2,400, and then Susan cheats, she gets 500, and he loses 100, so he goes to 2,300. Well, now he's going to cheat every time. He's not going to risk losing 100 again. He's going to tell Susan, well, no, I'm going to cooperate, so you cooperate too, and let's get some more money. But they both cheat each other. So then he ends up with 2,290, and she ends up with 2,890. Okay? So, knowing that, well, if you think, well, if we were to go to round 10, I could end up with 3,200, but if Sam thinks that, then he might cheat. And so if Sam were to cheat, or Susan were to cheat the round 9, well, what if we just moved it up another round, cheat a little bit earlier again, to try to get a jump on someone? So again, Susan is a cheater just for simplicity of the charts. But we go here till you get to 2,100 in round 7, and then round 8, you have someone who cheats. They end up with 2,600, and the other person, Sam, goes to 2,000, and then they cheat each other the rest of the way through, so they're losing $10 a round, and you end up with 2,580 versus $1,980. So the rational thing to do here is to cooperate until you think you can get that cheat. Well, how far back can you go with this? Ultimately, you would go to the first round because you wouldn't want to risk. You would say, well, if I would cheat on the 10th round, but he may think about it, so he may cheat me on the 9th round, so I better cheat him on the 8th round, but then he might cheat me on the 7th round. You go back and back, and well, the first place you can get to is round 1. Okay, so suppose that from round 1, Susan says, look, I don't want to risk him cheating me, so I'm going to cheat from the get-go. And Sam cooperates, saying, hey, let's try to cooperate. So Sam ends up losing $100 at negative 100 on round 1, and Susan ends up at 500. And now they don't trust each other at all, so their other 9 turns, they cheat, and Sam ends up losing $190, and Susan ends up only with $410. Okay, so that's an outcome of cheating on the first turn, and then you cheat the rest of the time. Okay, so that's a possible outcome. Well, what if they both cheat each other the whole time? They start from the beginning saying, okay, they tell each other they're going to cooperate, but they cheat because they don't want to risk that. Well, then they both end up losing $100. Okay, because you lose $10 a round for 10 rounds, so you lose $100. Okay. Now, what about the absolute best and worst outcomes? Well, let's suppose that Sam cooperates every turn and Susan cheats every turn. Well, Sam would lose $100 for 10 turns, so he would lose $1,000. Susan would win $500 for 10 turns, so she would end up with $5,000. So those are the worst outcome is that you end up with a negative $1,000, and the best outcome is that you get a positive $5,000. So notice, though, the best possible outcome comes from cheating every turn. The worst possible outcome comes from cooperating every turn. So let's look at all of these possibilities. And of course, you could have any mixture of them, but these are just kind of the ones that we looked at. So the best possible outcome would be to cheat every turn and the other person cooperates every turn. You get $5,000. It's probably never going to happen. Okay. Cheat from at turn 10, cooperate for 9 turns and then cheat would be you'd end up with $3,200. Okay, so that's not bad. It's better than both of you cooperating each turn, which would end up with both of you having not the most money you could have, but having the most combined money is cooperating for 10 turns. Okay? If you cheat starting at round 1, then you would end up with $410 if the other person if they cooperated in the first round. And if everybody cheated from the beginning, then both of you would end up with negative $100, which would be the worst possible combined outcome, is that you cheat the whole time. If you were cheated round one, so it's the opposite of cheat round one here. If you were cheated round one, then you would end up with negative $190. And then the worst possible outcome would be if you cooperated every turn and the other person cheated every turn, you'd end up with 1,000, negative 1,000. So let's look at these options. The best possible outcome that you could have involves you cheating every turn. The second best of these that we've looked at involves you waiting till the very end to cheat. The third best option is that everybody cooperates. The fourth best option is that you start cheating from round one and the other person cooperates, so you get over on them from the beginning. The worst possible one that would be that you cooperate every time. And the second worst possible would be that you were cheated round one, so you started off cooperating, but then you were cheated the rest of the time. And the negative 100 apiece is the option here where everybody cheats the whole time. For the egoist, the rational thing to do is actually to cheat from the beginning. Because if you cooperate on round one, you could end up with a negative $190. If you cheat from round one, the worst thing that could happen is that you would end up with negative $100. Okay? If you simply get one of those rounds that you cheated and you win up over the other person, they cooperate, you could end up with a positive $410. So for the egoist, all of these are bad options. The altruists, if you were altruists, though, you could play this game and not have a problem. Because the egoist is only looking out for their option. Each turn, I either risk losing $100 or gaining $500. I'm always going to go for that which could give me a possible gain of $500 and keep me from potentially losing $100, which means I always cheat. If you are an altruist, however, and you're looking out for, Sam says, I don't care about what I want Susan to get the most money. Well, the best way to get Susan money would be if I cooperate every turn and she cheats every turn. Then she could end up with $5,000. And if Susan is also a altruist, then both Susan is thinking the same thing, so they cooperate every turn instead of cheating every turn, and they end up with $3,000 apiece, which is one of the better options. So the problem, this is the paradox of egoism, is sometimes to do what's in your best interest, you have to not do what is in your best interest. And these games kind of show that. The dilemma, the prisoner's dilemma, and the cheating game here show that sometimes when you try to do something that is in your best interest, it is not going to lead to the best outcome for you. Sometimes altruism is good and it provides benefits. Okay? So that's the paradox of egoism. We're going to talk briefly about quasi-moralist. A quasi-moralist position is someone who has basically two or more sets of moral standards. Maybe you treat family with respect and morals and others who are outside of the family without that. So within a loyalty group of some sort, you treat them with morality, and outside of that group, you treat people with, you're not ethical with them, so you're not moral with them. And so, you might see this in organized crime, where you might rob and cheat people on the street, but within the crime group itself, they expect loyalty and honesty. You might see this within certain types of societal groups. I understand that you might have kind of nomadic people, some kind of gypsy cultures that have that, or other different groups that have these loyalties that change radically between the group and inside and out. And the quasi-moralist position can be hard because it can be hard to raise children in that. And so Jack or Jim, should you be Jack or Jim? Well, that depends on, so Jack did a lot of bad things to Jim. The quasi-moralist would say be Jack or Jim, depending on, if Jim is part of this loyalty group, say it's family, then no, he couldn't do what he did to Jim. But if that person is outside of it, you wouldn't have the problem anyway with that. So quasi-moralist position, just understand that's out there. And then finally, we're going to talk about evolutionary altruism. And this is the idea that some altruistic behaviors are genetically predisposed and have a reproductive advantage. So that morality may have helped us survive as a species. That's the idea. Now we're going to talk real briefly about what's called the parable of the birds, a thought experiment here, to help illustrate this and how some kind of altruistic behavior might help with survival. So imagine for me that there's an isolated island and you've got a flock of birds. And these birds, they live on this island, and they have a problem sometimes that there are parasites on this island. And the parasites, think of them like ticks or something, they attach themselves to the heads of the birds. And so a bird with parasites all over it won't be able to see or fly, and it'll end up dying. So what these birds do is they groom one another. So when you have parasites, let's suppose that there's some kind of a ritual where they stand in front of another person and they present themselves for grooming. And the other bird will then eat the parasites off of the head of the bird and clean up the parasite problem. So they have to have another bird get the parasites off of them because they don't have hands. They can't do anything about a parasite on their face. So other birds do that. Okay. Now, within this flock of birds, we've got three types of birds: suckers, cheaters, and grudgers. Okay. A sucker is a bird that will groom any bird that asks for it, basically. If they request it, they present themselves, they groom them. So imagine if we had a flock of all birds were suckers. Every bird in the flock was sucker. That means if any other bird presents himself to it, they're going to groom them. What would happen to that bird population? Well, anytime a bird had a parasite problem, they would present themselves to any other bird for grooming, and that other bird would groom them. Would they lose some time for hunting for food and building nests and reproducing to groom the other bird? Yes. But what would that do to the population? Well, that would mean anytime anybody needed grooming, they could get it. So the population with all suckers would be fine. But now let's introduce a new bird into the mix, a cheater. And a cheater would be someone who, when they have a parasite problem, they present themselves to another bird for grooming, and they'll get groomed, but they never groom anybody else. They cheat. So they take advantage of the grooming that others do to help them, but they don't help other birds. So if we had a population that had just suckers and just cheaters, what would happen over time to these populations? Well, we would expect that the cheaters, since they don't spend any time helping the other birds, would have more time to get food, to build nests, to reproduce. They would spread their genes more broadly through the population. So you might have a very few cheaters at the beginning, and over time, more and more of the population would be the cheater gene and less of the sucker gene. And eventually, the suckers would spend so much time grooming all of these cheaters, because they always groom someone who presents them for grooming, and the cheaters never groom the suckers. So at some point, the suckers would probably die out of the flock, and you'd be left with a flock with just cheaters. But then what happens? If you have a flock with just cheaters, they're never going to groom one another. So the parasite problem would end up collapsing the whole flock. So the cheater gene would probably come to dominance in the flock, and then once that happened, the flock would end up dying. So if you had a group of just suckers, they would survive. If you had a group that had suckers and cheaters, then eventually the cheaters would overtake the group, and then the group would disappear. It would go extinct. But now let's add a third bird into the mix. This bird is a grudger. Okay? This bird is one that will present itself for grooming to anybody, and will groom any other bird, provided that that bird has never refused to groom them. So, if a grudger presents itself to a sucker, the sucker is going to groom it. If he presents himself to a cheater, the cheater is not going to groom him. So then that grudger will never groom that cheater. If the grudger presents himself to another grudger, then they'll groom them. If a cheater who has not cheated a grudger presents himself, then the grudger will groom it. But if the cheater ever cheats him, then the grudger won't. So let's suppose that we have a flock that has suckers, cheaters, and grudgers in it. Or let's suppose we have a flock of just grudgers. What would happen? Well, the grudger would groom any bird that doesn't cheat them, so the grudgers would be fine. They would groom one another just like a flock with all suckers would. What about a flock with suckers and grudgers? What would happen? Well, the suckers would always groom the grudgers would always groom the suckers. There's no cheaters, so the grudgers wouldn't stop doing that. So the flock would probably be fine. What if you have a group with suckers, cheaters, and grudgers? Well, The suckers would always groom anybody. The grudgers would end up grooming one another and grooming the suckers. And the cheaters would be able to get groomed by everybody at first, but eventually the grudgers would not groom the cheaters, and the suckers would continue to groom the cheaters. So the suckers may have pressure put on them, and even if the suckers ended up dying out because they were unable to reproduce as much, then you would be left with just cheaters and grudgers, and the grudgers eventually would not clean the cheaters. So eventually the cheaters then would die out, and you would be left with just grudgers. So the possibility here is you would have either a population that would become everybody is a grudger, or perhaps you could have some balance between sucker, cheater, and grudger that works out, and they're still able to maintain all of those. But the idea, the whole point of this parable of the birds, if you will, is to demonstrate how certain behaviors may have some kind of reproductive or survival advantage, and use that as a way to try to explain how morality may have a very naturalistic reproductive advantage, survival advantage to it. So moral behaviors, right and wrong, may be vestiges of these kinds of behaviors that helped our ancestors survive at some point in the past. And so that's kind of the perspective that evolutionary altruism would take there. And so you may not have a clear answer on whether you should be Jack or Jim there. It would be whatever increases your opportunity to survive, either individually or perhaps as a culture, there on whether you should be Jack or Jim. All right. Well, this concludes the presentation, the lecture for this time. And so make sure you comment in the discussion board with any questions that you have, and complete the readings and the assignments for this section. And I'll see you next time.